All right, so we're in the book now called The Conquest of the New World or American Holocaust, marked by David E. Stannard. It says here Columbus' second voyage was the true beginning of the invasion of the Americas. The royal instructions authorizing the expedition had directed that the finest ships in Andalusia be outfitted for the trip and that they be commanded by the most expert pilots and navigators in the realm. 17 ships made the voyage, and aboard those ships were more than 1,200 soldiers, sailors, and colonists, including a cavalry troop of lancers and half a dozen priests. In early January of 1494, the fleet arrived at the place on the northern coast of Hispaniola that Columbus had chosen to build his new world. So his new world order capital, it says here, his town of Isabella. No sooner were the ships unloaded, however, than sickness broke out among the crews. So as soon as they got there, they already had a disease with them. It quickly spread among the natives who had come to greet the ships with gifts of fish and fruits, as if we had been their brothers, recalled one of the men on board. Within a few days, the admiral's surgeon reported a third of the Spaniards had fallen ill, while natives everywhere were dead. If, as the Spanish physician and medical historian Francisco Guerra now contends, the epidemic that ravaged Hispaniola in 1494 was swine influenza, swine, it would have been a pestilence of devastating proportions, for it now appears that it was swine flu that swept the world in 1918, killing at least 20 million people before it finally dissipated. Like other people in the Americas, and unlike the Spanish, the natives of Hispaniola had no previous exposure to the virus, nor to the numerous other diseases that historically, in other parts of the world, had spread from domesticated animal hosts. Other than small dogs in some locations and llamas or llamas in the Andes, few animals were domesticated anywhere in the hemisphere. And of the many plagues that in time would overwhelm the Americas, native peoples, influenza of various types from both humans and non-human vectors was a second only to smallpox and maybe measles as the most rapid epidemic killer of them all. Talking about Deuteronomy 28. All right, is this not one of the things, right? Disease, viruses, blisters, and boils in the skin, right? Whatever it was, in any case, the imported pathogen moved among the native people with a relentlessness that nothing ever had in all their history. So many Indians died that they could not be counted. So many of your ancestors were wiped out, wrote Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo, adding that all through the land, the Indians lay dead everywhere. And I have his books, Oviedo in Spanish, the original ones, and it is in there. The stench was very great and pestiferous. All right, so there's dead people laying everywhere. Again, Deuteronomy 28. The stench was very great and pestiferous, and in the wake of the plague they had introduced plague, the Spanish soldiers followed, seeking gold from the natives or information as to where to find it. They were troubled by the illness, and numbers of them died from it. But unlike the island natives, the European invaders and their forebears had lived with epidemic pestilence for ages. Their lungs were damaged from it, their faces scarred with pox. But accumulations of disease exposure allowed them now to weather much. So they carried infections with them everywhere they went, burdensome, but rarely fatal, except to that natives that they met. So they were already immune to it. All these diseases, they were like basically carriers of all this death, right? Harbingers of death. Following the admiral's orders, reconnaissance parties were sent out across the island and off to Cuba, Jamaica, and to other nearby lands. The Spanish plagues raced on ahead. Still, the natives, as Columbus had observed during his first voyage, continued to be kind and generous to their guests, and so innocent in the use of dangerous weapons that when Columbus showed them swords, he said, they grasped them by the blade and cut themselves through the ignorance. Wherever the marauding disease and heavily armed Spanish forces went out on patrol, accompanied by ferocious armored dogs that had been trained to kill and disembowel, they preyed on the local communities, already plagued and feebled, forcing them to supply food and women and slaves. Slaves, all right, slaves, and whatever else the soldiers might desire. All right, so before we continue, just wanted to show one example of these war dogs, or dogs that the these conquistadors, the Spanish, Portuguese conquistadors had with them when they came to the Americas. All right, so we got this Alano Español, or the Spanish Alano. It says here the breed is best known for its former use during Spanish bullfights. They used to put them against bulls. That's how strong these dogs are. The Devastation of the Indies, a brief account by Bartolomé de las Casas. All right, we already know who that is. He was there. This is a personal account, Bartolomé de las Casas. And it says, the Indies were discovered in the year 1492, or rediscovered. In the following year, a great many Spaniards went there with the intention of settling the land. Thus 49 years have passed since the first settlers penetrated the land. The first soul claimed being the large and most happy isle called Hispanola, which is 600 leagues in circumference. Around it in all directions are many other islands, some very big, others very small, and all of them were, as we say, with our own eyes, densely populated with native peoples called Indians. This large island was perhaps the most densely populated place in the world. Again, from Bartolomé de las Casas' own personal account, he told you from our own eyes. He's telling you Hispaniola, this large island, was perhaps the most densely populated place in the world, not just in the Caribbean or America, in the world. There must be close to 200 leagues of land on this island, and the seacoast has been explored for more than 10,000 leagues, and each day more of it is being explored, and all the land so far discovered is a beehive of people. It is as though God had crowded into these lands the great majority of mankind. All right, densely populated all over the place, millions and millions of people. All right, true old world. This is the true old world. That's why, like he said, as though God had crowded these lands, the great majority of mankind, and all of the infinite universe of humanity. These people are the most guileless, the most devoid of wickedness and duplicity, the most obedient and faithful to their native masters and to the Spanish Christians whom they serve. They are by nature the most humble, patient, and peaceable, holding no grudges, free from embroilments, neither excitable nor quarrelsome. These people are the most devoid of rancors, hatreds, or desire for vengeance of any people in the world. Again, we're in the book Devastation of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. And he says, yet into this sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards, who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days. And Spaniards have behaved in no other way during the past 40 years, down to the present time. For they are still acting like ravening beasts, killing, terrorizing, afflicting, torturing, and destroying the native people, doing all this with the strangest and most varied new methods of cruelty never seen or heard of before. And to such a degree that this island of Hispaniola, once so populous, having a population that I estimated to be more than 3 million, have now a population of barely 200 persons. The island of Cuba is nearly as long as the distance between Valladolid and Rome. It is now almost completely depopulated. San Juan and Jamaica are two of the largest, most productive and attractive islands. Both are now deserted and devastated. On the northern side of Cuba and Hispaniola lie the neighboring Lucayos, comprising more than 60 islands, including those called Gigantes. Beside numerous other islands, some small, some large, the least felicitous of them were more fertile and beautiful than the gardens of the King of Seville. Boom! We're talking about paradise. We're talking about a fertile place, rich soil, Kemet, rich soil. Alright, more beautiful than the gardens of the King of Seville. Alright, de la Casas is telling you. They have the healthiest lands in the world. They have the healthiest lands in the world. We're talking about America, right here in the Caribbean, that doc telling you. Where lived more than 500,000 souls. They are now deserted. Talking about the Lucayos, inhabited by not a single living creature. All the people were slain or died after being taken into captivity and brought to the island of Hispaniola to be sold as slaves. So who they bring into Hispaniola? Not Africans. They're bringing other American Indians that they enslaved, made their home islands deserted by putting them in captivity and taking them to Hispaniola to be sold as slaves. All right, and to other colonies from there. When the Spaniards saw that some of these had escaped, they sent a ship to find them, and it voyaged for 3 years among the islands, searching for those who had escaped being slaughtered. For a good Christian had helped them escape, taken pity on them, and had won them over to Christ. Of these, there were 11 persons, and these I saw. So we know who the Spanish and Portuguese were enslaving, right? All right, so De las Casas is telling you, who were they enslaving really and bringing over? Not Africans, right? So far, nothing about Africans, right? More than 30 other islands in the vicinity of San Juan are for the most part and for the same reason depopulated, and the land laid waste. On these islands, I estimate there are 2,100 leagues of land that have been ruined and depopulated, empty of people that were put into slavery. I sent to plantations. Requerimiento, remember? At virtually every previous landing on this trip, Columbus troops had gone ashore and killed indiscriminately, as though for sport, whatever animals and birds and natives they encountered, looting and destroying all they found. As the admiral's son Fernando blithely put it, once on Hispaniola. However, Columbus fell ill, whether from the flu or more likely from some other malady, and what little restraint he had maintained over his men disappeared as he went through a lengthy period of recuperation. They're telling you that he lost control of the troops because he was trying to survive. Basically, he had a disease or something. He was ill, and he's bedridden, and so everybody's going wild. Everybody's just doing whatever they want. The troops went wild. I just said it, stealing, killing, raping, and torturing natives, trying to force them to divulge the whereabouts of the imagined treasure houses of gold. The Indians tried to retaliate by launching ineffective ambushes of stray Spaniards, but the combined killing force of Spanish diseases and Spanish military might was far greater than anything the natives could ever have imagined. Finally, they decided the best response was flight. Crops were left to rot in the fields as the Indians attempted to escape the frenzy of the Conquistadors' attacks. Again, crops were left to rot. Starvation then added its contribution, along with pestilence and mass murder, scriptural, to the native people's woes. Some desperate Hispaniola natives fled to the other islands. One of them, a cacique named Hatuey, brought with him to Cuba as many of his surviving people as he could, and what little gold that they possessed. The massacres continued. Columbus remained ill for months while his soldiers wandered freely. More than 50,000 natives were reported dead from these encounters by the time the admiral had recovered from his sickness. And when at last his health and strength had been restored, Columbus' response to his men's unorganized depredations was to organize them. In March of 1495, he massed together several hundred armored troops, cavalry, and a score of more of trained attack dogs. They set forth across the countryside, tearing into assembled masses of sick and unarmed native people, slaughtering them by the thousands, slaughtering them by the thousands. This is Columbus, and that's your hero on Columbus Day. The pattern set by these raids would be the model the Spanish would follow for their next decade. Again, you see what Columbus started? The pattern set by these raids would be the model, again, for the Spanish would follow for the next decade and beyond, as Bartolomé de las Casas, the most famous of the accompanying Spanish missionaries from that trip, recalled. Once the Indians were in the woods, the next step was to form squadrons and pursue them, and whenever the Spaniards found them, they pitilessly slaughtered everyone like sheep in a corral. You hear this, right? It was a general rule among the Spaniards to be cruel. They didn't just kill you, they were cruel when they did it. Not just cruel, but extraordinarily cruel, so that harsh and bitter treatment would prevent Indians from daring to think of themselves as human beings or having a minute to think at all. So they would cut an Indian's hands and leave them dangling by a shred of skin, and they would send him on saying, "Go now, spread the news to your chiefs." So they'd cut off your hand and do things like that to be cruel, to scare them, to go show like, look, this is what's gonna happen to everybody. These people were evil. These are evilness. This is evilness. They would test their swords and their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on the slicing of heads or the cutting of bodies in half with one blow. They burned or hanged captured chiefs. And you see this last paragraph again, that's from De las Casas. He wrote this in the original accounts he has. I'm going to get into that. At least one chief, the man considered by Columbus to be Hispanola's ranking native leader, was not burned or hanged. However, he was captured, put in chains, and sent off by ship for public display and imprisonment in Spain. Where? In Spain. Like most of the Indians who had been forced to make that voyage, though, he never made it to Seville. He died en route. Seville, one of their slave markets over there. And when they got over there, these so-called Indians were listed as Negroes. He died en route. With the same determination Columbus had shown in organizing his troops, previously disorganized and indiscriminate killings, the admiral then set about the task of systematizing their haphazard enslavement of the natives. All right, so you heard that, right? Began the enslavement. Once he raided it all, had them in check, had conquered, then came time for money. Remember, this is gold. Gold was all that they were seeking. So every Indian on the island who was not a child was ordered to deliver to the Spanish a certain amount of the precious ore every 3 months. When the gold was delivered, the individual was presented with a token to wear around his or her neck as proof that the tribute had been paid. Anyone found without the appropriate number of tokens had his hands cut off. You hear this? Since Hispanola's gold supply was far less than what the Spaniards' fantasy suggested, Indians who wished to survive were driven to seek out their quotas of the ore at the expense of other endeavors, including food production. The famines that had begun earlier when the Indians attempted to hide from the Spanish murderers now grew much worse, while new diseases that the Spanish carried with them preyed ever more intensely on the malnourished and weakened bodies of the natives, and the soldiers never ceased to take delight in killing just for fun. Spanish reports of their own murderous sadism during this time are legion. For a lark, they tore babies from their mother's breast by their feet and dashed their heads against the rocks. Imagine this could be your baby. Imagine they tore babies from their mother's breast by their feet and dashed their heads against the rocks. The bodies of other infants they spitted, together with their mothers and all who were before them on their swords. On one famous occasion in Cuba, a troop of 100 or more Spaniards stopped by the banks of a dry river and sharpened their swords on the wet stones in its bed, eager to compare the sharpness of their blades. Reported an eyewitness to the events, they drew their weapons and began to rip open the bellies, to cut and kill those lambs, men, women, children, and old folks, old people, elders, all of whom were seated, off guard and frightened, watching the Maris or mares and the Spaniards. And within two credos, not a man of all of them remains alive. The Spaniards entered the large house nearby, for this was happening at its door, and in the same way with cuts and stabs began to kill as many as they found there, so that a stream of blood was running, as if a great number of cows had perished. To see the wounds which covered the bodies of the dead and dying was a spectacle of horror and dread. So continuing says, this particular slaughter began at the village of Sucayo, where the town folk earlier had provided for the conquistadors a feast of cassava, fruit, and fish. From there it spread. No one knows just how many Indians the Spanish killed in this sadistic spree, but Las Casas put the number at well over 20,000 before the soldiers' thirst for horror had been slaked. Another report, this one by a group of concerned Dominican friars, concentrated on the way the Spanish soldiers treated native infants. Some Christians encountered an Indian woman who was carrying in her arms a child at suck, and since the dog they had with them was hungry, they tore the child from the mother's arms and flung it still living to the dog. As for the vast mainland, which is 10 times larger than all Spain, even including Aragon and Portugal, containing more land than the distance between Seville and Jerusalem, or more than 2,000 leagues, we are sure that our Spaniards, with their cruel, abominable acts, have devastated the land and exterminated the rational people who fully inhabited it. We can estimate very surely and truthfully that in the 40 years that have passed, with the infernal actions of the Christians, there have been unjustly slain more than 12 million men. All right, we're talking about his estimates, right? More than 12 million men, women, and children. In truth, I believe without trying to deceive myself that the number of the slain is more like 15 million. All right, the common ways mainly employed by the Spaniards who call themselves Christian and who have gone there to extirpate those pitiful nations and wipe them off the earth is by unjustly waging cruel and bloody wars. All right, we're talking about Papal Bull, Dum Diversas. Pitiful nations, wipe them off. We're talking about perpetual servitude. Then, when they have slain all those who fought for their lives or to escape the tortures they would have to endure, that is to say, when they have slain all the native rulers and young men, since the Spaniards usually spare only the women and children who are subjected to the hardest and bitterest servitude ever suffered by man or beast, they enslave any survivors. They will be sold. With these infernal methods of tyranny, they debase and weaken countless numbers of those pitiful Indian nations. Their reason for killing and destroying such infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold and to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time, and thus rise to a high estate disproportionate to their merits. It should be kept in mind that their insatiable greed and ambition, the greatest ever seen in the world, is the cause of their villainies. And also those lands are so rich. Again, those lands, America, those lands are so rich and felicitous. The natives people so meek and patient, so easy to subject. All right, so they're so easy to enslave that our Spaniards have no more consideration for them than beasts. And I say this from my own knowledge of the acts I witnessed. He's telling you firsthand accounts he witnessed. Continuing in the book Devastation of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas, all right, he says, Hispanola. On the island Hispanola was where the Spaniards first landed, as I have said. Here, those Christians perpetrated the first ravages and oppressions against the native peoples. This was the first land in the New World to be destroyed and depopulated by the Christians. And here they began their subjection of the women and children, taking them away from the Indians to use them and ill use them. All right, again, taking away children, eating the food they provided with their sweat and toil. The Spaniards did not content themselves with what the Indians gave them of their own free will, according to their ability, which was always too little to satisfy enormous appetites. For a Christian eats and consumes in one day an amount of food that would suffice to feed 3 houses inhabited by 10 Indians for 1 month. And they committed other acts of force and violence and oppression, which made the Indians realize that these men had not come from heaven. And some of the Indians concealed their foods, while others concealed their wives and children, and still others fled to the mountains to avoid the terrible transactions of the Christians. And the Christians attacked them with buffets and beatings, until finally they laid hands on the nobles of the villages. Then they behaved with such temerity and shamelessness that the most powerful ruler of the islands had to see his own wife raped by a Christian officer. Are you hearing this? All right, the chief, the cacique. Imagine the elder, the most respected person in the tribe. He has to see his own wife, the queen, the wife of the cacique, getting raped. From that time onward, the Indians began to seek ways to throw the Christians out of their lands. They took up arms, but their weapons were very weak and of little service in offense and still less in defense. Because of this, the wars of the Indians against each other are little more than games played by children. And the Christians, with their horses and swords and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties against them. They attacked the towns and spared neither the children, nor the aged, nor the pregnant woman, nor women in childbed, not only stabbing them and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces, as if dealing with sheep in the slaughter house. All right, you hear this cruelty. All right, I know this is graphic, but we can't forget what happened. They made some low white gallows on which the hanged victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing up their victims in lots of 13 in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles. All right, you hear that? So they were killing your ancestors. They were hanging them, barely with their feet touching the ground. All right, in the name of Jesus, Jesus, in memory of their Redeemer and his 12 apostles, says it. Then set burning wood at their feet, and thus burned them alive. To others they attached straw or wrapped their whole bodies in straw, and set them afire. With still others, all those they wanted to capture alive, they cut off their hands, and hung them around the victim's neck, saying, "Go now, carry the message," meaning, take the news to the Indians who have fled to the mountains. They usually dealt with the chieftains and nobles in the following way. They made a grid of rods, which they placed on forked sticks, then lashed the victims to the grid and lighted a smoldering fire underneath, so that little by little, as those captives screamed in despair and torment, their souls will leave them. So you hear what they did to the chiefs, the caciques? Are you hearing the cruelty, the genocide? I once saw this when there were 4 or 5 nobles lashed on grids and burning. I seem even to recall that there were 2 or 3 pairs of grids where others were burning, and because they uttered such loud screams that they disturbed the captain's sleep, he ordered them to be strangled. And the constable, who was worse than an executioner, did not want to obey that order. And I know the name of that constable, and know his relatives in Seville, but instead put a stick over the victims' tongues so they could not make a sound, and he stirred up the fire, but not too much, so that they roasted slowly as he liked. See this? I saw all these things I have described and countless others, alright? This is what happened. This was what was happening. We're in the book still, Devastation of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. Because the particulars that enter into these outrages are so numerous, they could not be contained in the scope of much writing. For in truth, I believe that in the great deal I have said done here, I have not revealed the thousandth part of the sufferings endured by the Indians. I know I now want only to add that in the matter of these unprovoked and destructive wars, and God is my witness, all these acts of wickedness I have described, as well as those I have omitted, were perpetrated against the Indians without cause, without any more cause than could give a community of good monks living together in a monastery. And still more strongly I affirm that until the multitude of people on this island of Hispaniola were killed and their lands devastated, they committed no sin against the Christians that would be punishable by man's laws. And as to those sins punishable by God's laws, such as vengeful feelings against such powerful enemies, as the Christians have been, those sins would be committed by the very few Indians who are hard-hearted and impetuous. And I can say this from my great experience with them, their hardness and impetuosity would be that of children, of boys 10 or 12 years old. Alright, you heard that? I know by certain infallible signs that the wars waged by the Indians against the Christians have been justifiable wars, and that all the wars waged by the Christians against the Indians have been unjust wars, more diabolical than any wars ever waged anywhere in the world. This I declare to be so of all the many wars they have waged against the peoples throughout the Indies. After the wars and the killings had ended, when usually there survived only some boys, some women, and children, these survivors were distributed among the Christians to be slaves. The repartimiento or distribution was made according to the rank and importance of the Christians to whom the Indians were allocated, one of them being given 30, another 40, still another 1 or 200, and besides the rank of the Christians there was also to be considered in what favor he stood with the tyrant they called governor. Alright, so they're talking about human. The pretext was that these allocated Indians were to be instructed in the articles of the Christian faith, as if those Christians who were as a rule foolish and cruel and greedy and vicious could be caretakers of souls. And the care they took was to send the men to the mines to dig for gold, which is intolerable labor. That's slavery. That's not to convert. They wanted them for slaves. And to send the women into fields of the big ranches to hoe and to till the land, work suitable for strong men. Nor to either the men nor the women did they give any food except herbs and legumes, things of little substance, the milk and the breasts of the women with infants dried up, and thus in a short while the infants perished. Devastation of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. And since men and women were separated, there could be no marital relations, and the men died in the mines and the women died on the ranches, from the same causes, exhaustion and hunger, and thus was depopulated that island which had been densely populated. I will speak only briefly of the heavy loads the Indians were made to carry, loads weighing 3 to 4 arrobas. Christian tyrants and captains had themselves carried in hammocks, borne by 2 Indians. This shows that they treated the Indians as beasts of burden. But when I, to describe all this and the buffetings and beatings and birchings endured by the Indians, add their labors, no amount of time and paper could encompass this task. The islands of San Juan and Jamaica. The Spaniards passed over to the islands of San Juan and Jamaica, both of them veritable gardens and beehives of activity. Veritable gardens. In the year 1509, with the aim and purpose of making these islands a part of Hispaniola, and on those islands of the Spaniards, perpetrated the same acts of aggression against the Indians and the wicked deeds described above. So they did the exact same things we just read, the atrocities, right? The cruelties. here in San Juan in Jamaica. All right, adding to the many outstanding cruelties, massacres, and burnings of the people, or executing them by flinging them to the fierce dogs, torturing and oppressing the survivors, condemning them to the hard labor of the mines, thus eradicating them from the earth, despoiling the land of those unfortunate and innocent people. Before the arrival of the Spaniards, there had lived on these islands more than 600,000 souls. It has been stated, I believe there were more than 1 million inhabitants, and now in each of the two islands there are no more than 200 persons, all the others having perished without the faith and without the holy sacraments.